Well, thank you very much, Josh. It is a pleasure to have you, and I'm sure we're gonna have some people streaming in as we continue along here. But I'm gonna get started and allow you to get started. And I want to welcome you first as one of the first workshops that we've done, and this is for the Bay Area MLOps chapter group that we've created a while back. And yeah, for those who are joining the sessions as well tomorrow, they're gonna start at let's see here. I think 10:45 is the first one. 10:45, and we'll have a couple consistent sessions going on simultaneously, both on more strategy side and then some technical breakdown and case studies as well. And that will go on until about 12:30 in the afternoon. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. For those who don't know Josh, you're in for a treat. Josh leads the design for ethics and society at Microsoft, where his team works at the intersection of product development, user experience, AI, law, and philosophy. So he comes packing a punch and quite a lot of interesting perspective there. So we were really happy to get Josh to help out with this. And prior to Microsoft, he was the UX lead for People Plus AI research at Google, and founded Amazon's unified design system for online shopping experiences. So Josh, I'll be here throughout the talk if you have any questions. I'm also going to be checking the chat for questions that we could field throughout the session. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll get at them at the first opportunity. And with that said, Josh, I'll kick it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Yeah, please feel free to jump in. So if there's a question, pop it in the chat, or even just to sort of raise a digital hand. Being that it's a workshop format, we'll do our best to make it more conversational oriented. My favorite kind of presentation is really one where we kind of get to the second or third follow-up question for a topic area to really feel like we're exploring something. So I will jump into full screen land, and as a result, sometimes in full screen land can feel a little bit on an island. So again, please don't hesitate to jump in. So the title of this talk is AI on Purpose, and you can think about it a little bit like an essay in visual and verbal format. I'm going to cover a number of different things, but first just a little preamble about who I am and what this is and isn't. So as Dave said, I lead design for a team called Ethics and Society at Microsoft, and a part of the company called Cloud and AI, which, just look at those two words, they cover a pretty broad range of topics and categories and applications. Our team covers anything from work with the US military around augmented reality and combat scenarios to looking at ways that we can safeguard the responsible deployment of synthetically generated speech, things that can mimic the sound and affectation of an individual's voice, all the way to quite recently trying to impact the way that we approach consent for product improvement for AI-powered products. In this case, again, specifically around speech. So covers this range. When we say design, it's the things that affect people in real life, and working backwards from that, we collaboratively build with product teams. So ours is not a think tank or ivory tower type of organization. You can think about it as a bit more like a consultancy incubation group applied in the context of trying to ship and build products, software, solutions, services, what have you. We say we're successful not when we've sort of told anybody what's right or wrong, because that's not a real thing, but really instead when we've collectively tried to define what it means for us as a group of people to make something and do it responsibly. But this isn't going to be a talk about case studies for those specific things. I have other talks about that stuff, and it's super important to talk through the nuts and bolts of how we ship those things. But I actually wanted to get into a slightly different area for this conversation, because it's something I'm quite keen on trying to move the ball forward on. I find in my day-to-day work, so much of the effort that our team has to undertake is dealing with broadening the disciplines that are involved, the focuses involved, the definition of stakeholders that are involved, the way that we think about data. There's all these different attributes of human-centered design that should essentially be indistinguishable from just good product engineering. And AI has caused us to do a bunch of stuff that maybe feels like it's brand new, but really it's actually some reinvention of stuff we've always been doing, which is being clear about our intent and trying to drive towards product excellence, and then iterating going forward. But there are some new things, and I want us, in service of a better, sort of brighter future, I want some stuff that I can take for granted. And I just set an arbitrary timeline. Let's say the end of next year. I think it might be aggressive potentially, but I've actually been wanting to take some of this stuff for granted for about the last 5 years. So take that for what it's worth. Those considerations start with, and this is probably the hardest starting point, casting out towards and using our imagination about the most probable future states. Machine learning, if you take nothing else away from this, and you all work in the field in different ways, shape, and forms, but machine learning is a pattern recognition science, right? It's the amazing opportunity to cast our sort of digital gaze backwards, look at attributes and patterns and progress that we want to repeat going forward so that we can make better predictions or more insightful predictions going forward, right? So AI doesn't produce data, AI produces predictions. And that means that if we didn't touch anything and we just sort of let the status quo keep on going, the things that go without saying about societal norms and ways that certain groups work, ways that certain genders play a role, ways that certain disciplines play a role, ways that certain geographic ancestries or racial or ethnic groups play a role, or ways that we think about what is just a good product experience. If we just don't talk about that, then there is an outcome that we'll arrive at. It'll be the default outcome. But if we can take a step back and think about the most probable future, then we can do this kind of wild and maybe seemingly crazy-making activity of looking at possible futures. And that, as Dave talked about in the intro, actually requires us to involve quite a bit more disciplines. So we have to think about, the way that we research this stuff, the social systems. We have to think about the law and the regulatory space. We have to think about how we write about it, how we do press about it, how we design the pixels, but also how we design the conventions and the interactions. There's a lot of possible futures, infinite maybe. And so we can't cater to all of those possible futures, but at least we can do something. And again, this is the last most crucial sort of intro part, is we can write something down about what we think are characteristics of preferable futures. Not good, not bad, not perfect, but preferable. Because when a group of people can look at each other across the digital room or the physical room and say, this is what I think a preferable future looks like, well, then we can get into the great work that comes from knowing where there are gaps and opportunities and being able to measure whether we're actually achieving attributes of those preferable futures. So probable, possible, and preferable. And to move that conversation forward, I think there are actually 3 sub-conversations, again, things that I really, really, really want to take for granted. And they end up being about, the things that are uniquely AI and uniquely human, capability understanding, about accuracy, because again, we're talking about a different type of medium with probabilistic systems. They're different from deterministic systems. You can't just say, I've got a system that, is going to output reliable telemetry in a very fixed, rigid definition of those telemetry. I actually need to define spaces and confidence intervals and things that actually might be contextually nuanced. So accuracy changes shape. And with those 2 things in mind, it then actually changes the way we think about our accountability. And I'll say, I think people need to understand and have an intuition about how systems work that are, properly complex, such as AI, so that they actually can figure out what it means to take accountability. So the first conversation is about capability. And again, this is the first thing that jumps in that I wish I could take for granted, is that oftentimes we as an industry begin in this place of using language that I think can be kind of unintentionally dehumanizing about, AI systems that quote unquote achieve human parity, and also language about how people can achieve more machine-like efficiency. And we forget that there are actually some really important differences between what is uniquely human and what is uniquely AI. I spilled out a few. This is my own interpretation that's come from different reading and experience and pulling from different research. And ultimately, it comes down to our need to thrive on the new. The fact that we get distracted is a benefit from a human perspective. It allows us to explore in dynamic ways. We get curious. We get tired of the boring things. We actually can take in a lot of different stimuli. Our cognitive and neurological systems have evolved such that we have incredibly specialized and diverse myriad processors that end up coming together under a unified controller to make predictions ourselves, right? Machine learning is, after all, modeled after us. But we don't do all the stuff that's on the right side. We don't just thrive on repetition. We cannot turn off our mood or our emotional response to be insensitive to the things around us. We can't respond perfectly instantly because, again, we have to do this, cognitive regulatory process of making predictions and imagining future states. And we certainly don't have perfect recall, far from it. And that's actually one of the things that gets into a whole nother domain about privacy that is uniquely different with AI, because human memory is quite fallible. That's a benefit. It gives us the ability to be kind of invisible in public spaces and know that we have plausible deniability and that we don't just exist in some sort of permanent record, but lots more ubiquitous computing devices and spatial computing devices that exist around us and with us mean that we're all leaving these sort of permanent record paper trails that change our perspective on ourselves and how we even judge each other. So there's definitely some differences between things that humans can do and AI can do. And my sort of essay thesis statement will tell you, I think we should keep those separate and augmentative and not just try to pattern match one to the other. Some examples of from very basic systems that, this is AI. This is very conventional AI, but this uses a light curtain, just a light sensor. It's just doing a basic test to see if something is blocking that light curtain. And in the event of the light curtain being mostly obstructed, the door actuation turns on. Simple. Doesn't determine anything based on who you are, your age, your identity. It's just you can put a piece of paper in front of a light sensor and it'll open and close the door. Going to much more dynamic systems, this is seeing AI that uses multiple different parts of computer vision, from being able to do things like object text segmentation and recognition to say the physical attributes of what engrams, what letters look like, and then the natural language conversion into when those letters actually look like words, and then converting that into a text to speech that can read aloud for a person who is blind or low vision. It's a whole series of things that have to be sort of guessed along the way to make a magical experience come to life. It's not just the AI does magic, it's all sorts of separate computer vision systems and natural language processing, and then speech phonetic representation that comes together to play out into a set of actuations. And then even to these really kind of wild and theoretical states, things, again, people can do at an intuitive level, but is far more expansive because of the corpus of information that AI can build from. This is super resolution. So this is the ability to, and again, this is a technical term, hallucinate pixels, where you can expand the canvas of a pixelated image and actually ask the AI, hallucinate, predict the pixels that should quote unquote fill in the blanks, and render at a higher resolution. And this can happen only because it's been exposed to millions upon millions of training images, things that no human being could do. But gosh, it's super interesting to think about the human applications of it. So lots of difference. But then you get into this whole other side where it kind of crosses over a boundary. There's been no shortage of people talking about computer vision systems that can do something like detect the presence of a face mask in a retail store. But what we forget sometimes when we're too many layers behind the system and just looking at the data or the telemetry or the dashboard is the human-to-human relationship that happens following a detection. So you certainly could have a system that says, hey, this person's face mask, as the gentleman on the right, is not covering his nose. Well, then what happens? And that part, you can't AI-ify that part. And because you can't AI-ify the part where some human has to talk to some other human, you need to actually work backwards from that different question, which is what would a store worker need in order to feel like they can actually make the right kind of change with a conversation with another person. And you might find very different, again, definitions of capabilities or accuracy. It might work better to do something like, generating aggregate reports about entrances that are more, likely to have people coming in who are not properly wearing a face mask, and then buddying up store workers so they don't have to go it alone into the emotional labor of having to confront an individual about the presence of a face mask. Or maybe better yet, you could have a shopper facing monitor that could actually highlight attributes of facial features that are present and shouldn't be. You can recognize there's a nose or a mouth, well, then a face mask's not present, and then people can better self-correct without the sort of the human to human thing. There's still going to be a human escalation in the event of somebody being unhappy. All these things tie together. So again, hopefully that makes it clear that there is a kind of a precipitously complex slope if you just start from accurately identifying a face mask versus looking at the emotional needs of somebody who might need to have a tough conversation with another person. So with capability in mind, and again, my desire selfishly to be able to take for granted that when we talk about AI, we're not talking about replacing people, and we're talking about people, we're not talking about just making them more efficient. Well, then we can get into more interesting territory. And to me, that next most interesting territory is redefining to a certain degree what working as intended means when we're talking about probabilistic systems. Again, things that will have fuzzy confidence, not with a perfect right or wrong that we normally have with traditional logic systems. So one example, and this one or something around this will often get quite a bit of attention in popular media, social media. The term you'll hear is fairness or unfairness. And I've done a lot of work in this area and can have a whole nother, again, there's a whole nother talk about fairness. But I want to talk about this through the lens of accuracy, because you might look at a result set like this. If an individual inputs a word like physicist into an image search, the kinds of results they might get back, as you can see, are looking predominantly male. And I guess our question becomes, is that the right answer? On the one side, if the fill in the blank kind of natural language processing generation, which is invisible, by the way, the user just typed in physicist. But if the natural language inputs or predicts that what the user might mean is show me the most referenced physicist, well, then this becomes a really accurate result set. And that's helpful. That's a useful way to think about it. But again, the user typed in a word, the AI predicted something about maybe intent behind that word. But on the other side, if the intent was something a little bit different, like what can a physicist look like? Well, then we get into inaccurate results and what many would call unfair results. Because if you're a young woman or young girl looking at the future of science and looking and being interested in studying physics, and this is your answer, might this inhibit you from pursuing a career that you otherwise might have been fascinated by? I think the answer has to be yes. So looking at that, suddenly it changes a single word or a single token into the question of what are the optimization goals that fill in the blanks. That's a design exercise. That's an opportunity for people to have had a conversation, but maybe they didn't. And maybe they just took it for granted. And maybe there was something that went without saying that we could instead look at more closely together. The way that I try to break this down in a more sort of technical granularity way, and follow me because there's some weird double negatives in here, is about the distinction between something that can be perceiver independent or perceiver dependent. Another way to think about these words usually are objective and subjective, but I find that those words can actually be kind of they can ruffle some feathers because whose objectivity and whose subjectivity. So with perceiver dependence, what we're talking about is how it might differ between people. So something that's perceiver dependent means if you ask 2, 3, 4 people, you're probably going to get 2, 3, 4 different answers. Their contexts, their life experiences, the things that have shaped their day might change the way that they interpret something. versus perceiver independence, which is you ask 2, 3, 4 different people something, and they're likely going to give you one fairly unified response, unaffected by their life experience, their context, and what they had for breakfast. So with that, we can look at how we might break some of these things down in starters about what might affect accuracy. And by the way, this means that we'd measure it. Like, how do we know that it's accurate or inaccurate versus inaccuracy? Doing an activity like this gives us a sense of stuff we might not actually know how to measure for today, and we might need to do a better job of measuring tomorrow so that we're not unintentionally inaccurate, right? Between 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 different people, if you ask them how to describe somebody's gender identity based on how they talk, right? This is a speech recognition example I should have clarified. But how they talk or how they look or how they present themselves, well, you should probably get a bunch of different answers. You know, it's not simple enough to say that women speak at a higher pitch or men speak at a lower pitch. That's not true. We know that. It's not, you know, visually, it's not simple enough to say women have longer hair and men have shorter hair. We also know that's not sufficient. Variation is the norm when it comes to the way that people express themselves. And that level of variation is also something that we prize about culture. And so when you look at that, you probably could, though, have some interesting conversations about how a speech recognition system should probably render inaccurately or affect accuracy if somebody's interrupted. But how do we define what an interruption is? Is that one little word that interjects? Is that a whole sentence? Unfamiliar words, whose definition of unfamiliar? Or how we enunciate? That should affect, right? If somebody has a bunch of, you know, phonetic compression where there are specific frequencies and words that come together in quick succession without a lot of variability, it's probably going to result in accuracy mismatches. But people aren't going to necessarily have the same notion of enunciation levels. You know, just ask somebody who's, you know, trying to listen to somebody talk from another country when you're less fluent in their language, and that might sound like poor enunciation because you don't know how to listen to certain kinds of sounds of the words. Now, on the other side of that are things that are perceiver independent, which actually can be a lot more fruitful to talk about in how we measure. And sometimes these can be especially fruitful because we can think about them as like almost proxies. So, you know, on the right side, something shouldn't be less accurate because a person speaking faster or slower. A words per minute is a count that we can all probably agree on. It's perceiver independent. Same thing with vocal pitch, same thing with pauses. Now, that level of pause that I just did to take a little bit of a breath, is that long enough? Is that short enough? We should still have a conversation about how long is a pause before I'm no longer dictating into my phone or whatever. But again, the way to measure that can be quite consistent. To pause between utterances. Same thing like proximity to microphone or the type of microphone, decibel level of speech. What I'm trying to get at with all this stuff is that it's both. When we talk about accuracy, there are social systems all over the place, stuff that we have to think about in terms of characteristics that should matter and shouldn't matter. But one of the benefits of having conversations, especially with groups that are more diverse, meaning different backgrounds, different educations, different groups, different cultures they come from, is you have to describe a bit more about what you mean by blank. And so embracing that kind of difference between perceiver dependence and perceiver independence can change the way we think about accuracy. So with those two things, and I know those were both quite complex and in some ways kind of like, you know, defining what is the nature of reality kind of conversations. Capability, not replacing people and not turning people into robots or machines. The concept of accuracy, which is really more like how can the things that we can collectively agree on be measured and how can the things that we don't agree on be measured. We can get into accountability, which is sometimes actually my favorite starting point. That's really more like, how can you ask people what they need in order to be accountable to the outputs of a system? Because there's two types of sort of not working as intended when it comes to automated systems. They share a lot in common, but their differences are important. In misuse, people use something in an unreliable way because they don't understand or appreciate its capabilities or limitations. Sometimes people use something despite knowing it isn't good for that purpose. But oftentimes it's because they think they understand it, but they don't actually. I think a lot of I'll cover this in a moment, but a lot of the like self-driving car or augmented, car assist stuff can fall into this category because people think it's either better or worse than it actually is. And that misunderstanding results in misuse. Disuse is another one. It's people stop using something because they just think it isn't that useful. And again, that often comes from a mismatch in expectations about capabilities and limitations. You can think about, you can probably ask Siri or Alexa or the Google Assistant millions of different things, but people pretty much ask three. Play some music, set a timer, and remind me something. Like that I think accounts for almost the entirety of the usage of those different interaction mechanisms. And that's because people they're like, okay, I've asked it stuff and it failed for me, so I'm not even going to try. One of the great things that our team tries to focus on, or one of the useful things I think our team tries to focus on, is making things more relatable. Turns out human beings have a lot of experience interacting with highly complex systems, highly complex probabilistic systems. They're called other people. And we have all sorts of great lived experience about how we learn how to grow to rely on other people. And again, given that there's so much to learn from, not to replace people or to make it seem like we're designing AI systems that should be people or whatever, but instead just to think about our own process of learning and make that the focus. So when we think about human-to-human contributors to trust, it actually follows this relatively serial path where we build predictions about what's going to happen in the future. This is just that we can't not do this. It's the human condition. And those predictions, we're kind of constantly going through this process of error correction and regulation of our own sort of cognitive effort. And as we make those predictions and those predictions start to line up with reality more and more, well, then we start to sort of take these little bets on each other. We're like, oh, maybe I can depend on this person for this, but not this. This is always compressed when we're dealing with somebody who's an expert in a specific domain, as we'll want to jump. Our predictions will be more focused initially. And if you're talking to like a doctor or a teacher or somebody who has a specific domain specialty, you're going to make predictions that are much more focused, specific initially because, well, they're sort of describing their capability, which is great. And you're growing to depend on them, but also the speed at which you're doing that can make those relationships feel kind of intense, right? If a doctor or a teacher lets you down or breaks a prediction or something that you thought you could depend on them, it can be quite an impact. And this is the real issue, is we have to learn how to give each other time and space to grow. Any good collaboration, any good team environment that any of you work within, you can feel this difference when you've just got to know somebody versus when you've got, months or even years under your belt of collaboration. One of the things that really resonated with me and affected me most emotionally in my own learning process about how people interact with one another was doing research with folks in the deaf and hard of hearing community, especially had an opportunity to learn from American Sign Language translators. And I went in with a set of assumptions about trust, and was really surprised to learn, and then not surprised when I thought about it for a second, that there is not an immediate level of trust. Despite an ASL translator being an expert, domain expert, this is their job. When a person who is deaf or hard of hearing begins to work with a new translator, they have a hefty amount of distrust. They watch that person like a hawk. They read their lips as much as they possibly can after they've finished signing, so that they can get a sense for what's being left out and what's being included. And that distrust wasn't a malintent or even assumption of malintent. It's just a process of learning. And so when they have the ability to choose, they will really hold off on bringing an ASL translator to a sort of a really essential meeting, like talking with a doctor or a lawyer or a counselor or something, until they have a much better predictive system and levels of dependability about what might get missed in translation, because it'll never be perfect, right? And growing from that experience really, shaped my own understanding about if that something where there needs to be dependability requires this ramp, this curve, well then what can we learn from that as we consider what's distinct about AI. And there's two things that I've really come down at, sort of, if you take nothing else away from this talk, nothing else away from what's different about designing for AI, it's that there's an automation bias where people actually have an unconscious preference for systems that they deem to be more objective when compared to human judgment. And that alongside that comes something that Dr. Micah Ensley calls the automation conundrum, which is that the more reliable a system becomes, then the more significant the risk of failure, because people are likely to sort of turn their brains off and over rely, right? More dependable equals more over reliance. So both these things really, they unify in that people are very likely to over rely much too quickly. Which brings us back to this, this kind of rendering of that trust curve, that set of activities that we go through cognitively when we're building trust in other people. And if we map it to AI, though, we get this totally wacky new curveball right up front, where we have to start by assuming over-reliance. And that over-reliance is basically set up for a serious cliff, but we don't always know where that cliff is. The cliff happens when people realize that there's some kind of fallibility in the AI system. Now, we can try to design to control that cliff, which I think we should. And we also have to start with the assumption that at some point, people will learn that the system doesn't work as intended, or it doesn't work the way that they thought, and they'll be left at the starting point again, the beginning of the hill climb that we're all used to, which is building predictability, dependability, and then moving on into faith. And so if we design these AI systems to expose more of the seams for how they render their predictions and where their sort of digital intuition comes from, we build with the expectation that people are going to need to make their own predictions. Well, then we end up designing a lot healthier systems. And that's really what true interpretability means. Interpretability isn't a log file that spits out a bunch of vectors about what a system, inferred, or activation curves or weights and biases. Instead, it's about the opportunity for a user to play with and interact with a system so they can build their own mental model. Now, this falls the farthest down, again, in these examples that we see around automation in safety critical domains. The sort of one of the most terrible examples, although we saw this with a bunch of the automatic flight stuff happening last year with Boeing too, is where there's an expectation that people are going to be able to take the controls back, to take the wheels back. But when we start to offload to these systems, and the systems are reliable enough, or seemingly reliable enough, we're actually not able to take the wheel back. We need more context. We need more of a mental model that's personal. We need more control and activity in the loop. And so I actually think it's a real failure of the current precedent that the driver in the Uber crash ended up being the one that was held liable. I would fundamentally disagree and say it was actually the Uber designers who mistakenly, really against all existing HCI research, did something that they knew a human couldn't do, which is react in a sub 2-second time interval to avoid a safety critical incident. So problems that we'll hopefully improve on as an industry going forward. And it'll all start if we can actually begin questions about accountability or interpretability or transparency or anything with asking a real person, hey, what do you need in order to feel confident taking accountability? Because that actually gives us our action items. That gives us the stuff that we can build into the product experience. That gives us the stuff we can build into telemetry and measurement systems. We can know if those things, those capabilities or data points are present or not. And it'll be different project to project. Ultimately, people need these things. We have to consider these are frailties of the human condition. But when I say frailties, what I really mean are features. They're things that are, again, going back to the things that make us uniquely human. We do a lot to manage our mental workload, and that prioritization process is something that we appreciate about each other. Our situational awareness is something that we, again, do our best to manage many different contributing factors and contextual factors that are happening all around us at any given moment, because we have to offload so much of our resources to the environment and to other people. Complacency, again, we want to be able to rely and trust on other systems, but that gets more significant with automation. And then, of course, skill degradation as we think about how we continue to use our skills as they are today, or whether or not we're going to give up some of those skills or some of the craft that we have today because the AI can offload certain things. So, what do we get in return? What's the time and the space that we can spend on something instead, as long as we can actually meet people where they're at. One kind of last system to try to break this into yet more granularity, or just to give some more words, is that automation doesn't have to be considered a all or nothing kind of design decision. Far from it. This comes from an HCI framework by a researcher named Parasuruman from well over like 15 years ago at this point. But it's really been brilliant for me because it offers me language that helps to kind of demystify what's happening. There's a lot of space between something being fully automated and something having no automation. It's really the difference of the levels of human control. Sometimes it's the level of human oversight, where from the very top, there's nothing that is offered in assistance. It's just totally up to human control. Up to, a step back from that, which is offering, a potentially limitless set of possible decisions and actions and saying, hey, you decide, all the way down lower in the list to say, maybe the system informs the people, but it's going to act by default, or maybe it won't inform them at all. But within that as well, there's these stages of automation that we get to design for. And this is the part in my conversations with data scientists, especially, has been really illuminating, because we get to think about how far back in the life cycle data needs to travel. Who decides, what decides, where the information is acquired from, what types of syntheses are happening in the information analysis, how potential decisions or selections get offered, and then of course, how the systems get implemented. And one example just to show, or two examples to show kind of the dichotomy there, is you can have something like a lane assist in a car, which is going to be gathering all of these things that are fully automated. There's no human control at all about, measuring proximity to lane demarcations, or running, sensory checks for, even visually trying to recognize what is a lane demarcation or another car, as well as monitoring things like speed, and weather conditions or rain conditions, slip, inertia, whatever. But then it starts to get, down quite a bit of a ramp when it comes time to actually changing lanes. That's a fully human decision. And here's where you sort of see that interesting boundary where there's really only one sort of thing that's rendered to the driver. There might be a beep if they begin to turn their wheel and they're too proximate to another vehicle. In the absence of that beep, they're just going to keep turning if they don't do a shoulder check. And we know that, again, people are likely to over-rely on these systems. So we have to look at that and say, well, are we talking about levels of granularity, or are we talking about, ways that we can better visualize these systems, or are they actually not helpful at all? I mean, the answer lies somewhere in between. Inverted from that, though, is something like autofocus for a camera, where it's entirely up to the photographer where to point the camera, which is to say where to acquire the information from. It then gets a little bit more granular as it goes up the stack into how synthesis happens, right? So it's looking at tons of different information, but the things to actually try to render finer detail on, like presence of faces or animals or whatever it might be, or proximity to a subject, to figure out how to do depth of field. All of that gets processed and is mostly still under human control because of where what they're deciding between. And then it gets into time to actually snap the photo, and it has to go full auto at that point. The photographer can select, which of the bounding boxes or which face, or they can, orient themselves better to the subject. But when they go and press the button for an autofocus, it all happens. And like that, it's over. So it's a very different kind of decision. It's a very different type of on-ramp into the action implementation, and changes the way that we think about the design. So again, take nothing else away. I know there's a lot of things, but automation bias changes how much we are likely to over-rely. And therefore, when we think about designing for this stuff, we don't necessarily have to just make it an all or nothing. We can build kind of this levels of gray. A few examples of that are just like, the way that we can do things like offering multiple paths. This can be an incredibly effective way to, kind of de-risk or open up new opportunities for innovation. Because, in this case, somebody doing a search for a word like lotus, well, that actually can mean all sorts of different potential things. And if you just let it do its thing and return the 10 most likely results, you might end up just getting a bunch of pictures of flowers or cars, but maybe it's neither one is actually what you wanted. Maybe you wanted something that's more like an illustration or in sort of a general domain space that's, around like yoga or meditation. But ultimately, in this possibility of looking at multiple paths, people get to use their own judgment. That's the kind of magical things. Subtle nods or subtle nudges that allow people to have a sense of perceived control and build their own intuition. Another example is about simulation. And in simulation, you can look at the actual trade-offs. So this is stuff that happens all behind the curtains when you're trying to build a route path. There's no shortage of different trade-offs that are happening, but how many of them are actually surfaced to the end user? So I offer a couple here of like flexibility versus directness, or sort of the average wait time at intersections versus the average speed that you can go. Those might be things that could actually spell the difference between significant significant change to your driving experience. But again, different people have different preferences, and looking at those trade-offs, actually, we know from our own research, helps people feel more in control and more like they can describe what the system is helping them do, rather than just, oh, the system just does it all for me. And lastly, this is one of my favorite sort of conventions, which is about building for simplifying or breaking down the components of an automated prediction, so that you can teach the system. So this is an example for a speech recognition system that actually breaks it down into phonemes. So rather than using a corporate jargon buzzword, CSAT, which many of you might be familiar with, customer satisfaction, it's just stuff that we use and it's pretty commonplace, but it's certainly not a normative term. So let's be honest about the fallibility. And instead of just rendering a really bad prediction, if there's a low confidence prediction, let's show that it's actually kind of low confidence by saying, how can this improve? So all these are sort of a set of examples, but again, it all comes back to having conversations and dialogue. None of this stuff, there's no perfect answer for it. There's no one right way or one wrong way, but there is a significant difference between I didn't mean for it to happen versus I actively tried to avoid something unwanted happening. And so, I would summarize this capability attribute by really saying the brilliance of being a person is the desire to reflect and continue to grow. We're sort of we as human beings are in a constant state of becoming what's next. We are not fixed or rigid in our capabilities. And so we shouldn't be building AI systems that perhaps reduce people into some sort of finite set of actions. Accuracy probably is better framed more in terms of mismatches and expectations. So where are there things that people expect to work and how they should work in certain conditions, and how do we plan to measure when and if they're meeting or mismatching those expectations? And then finally, I think, especially from my design perspective, when I think about accountability, it's really about the levels of control or usability. Somebody can be accountable to something when they actually can feel fluent or capable. So if you want to ask somebody, what do you need in order to feel like you understand? How can you say in your own words about what this thing can do and what you do and how it all works together? That's going to be a far better measurement of accountabilities in AI systems versus trying to talk about principles or values. And with that, I will close and open up to questions. I'll stop sharing as well, but I'm happy to reopen to any of these slides and chat through anything.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's fantastic. And there's so much there. It's good that it's recorded. I think everybody's gonna have to parse through that and probably take some time to let that sink in. So thank you so much. Yeah, everybody can feel free to post your questions. We'll give it some time so that some of those questions can come in. And In the meantime, I had a question for you, Josh. As I'm sure you're speaking with not just folks, within Microsoft, but probably folks within your network who may work for startups or who might work for larger organizations looking to implement or run AI within their organization. How would you recommend they get started having those conversations, or at least addressing, um, you know, the product development when it comes to AI and sort of what they should cover? I think a lot of people are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. We've seen in the last year or two um, a lot more consideration for algorithms, models in production, and some of the potential fallout that can happen if they're left to their own bias, or
Yeah.
left to sort of without that transparency. It can be a little overwhelming. Do you have any ideas as to where companies can get started? And then the second sort of follow up with that might be, what advice might you give them if it's a small startup versus maybe somebody that's running within a large company, design or product development?
That's a great question. I have seen a lot of examples that haven't gone well, where people begin from the perspective of, I'd say, being perceived as not trusting each other, or being perceived as though they're assuming malicious intent. So one of the hardest first things to figure out in like the social contract of a group, startup, big corporation, or otherwise, is how to get outside of the immediate perspectives and definitions within the group, so you can speak more in terms of advocacy for your users, for your customers, for the people that will actually be affected. And with that, I do think that the hardest transition is to make spaces where people can talk about some of their concerns about what might be missing. Who might not be included in the additional, like the initial range of power users or early adopters, who might not be included in the first market segmentation that you're pushing towards, and usually those are reflections of who might not be included within your own working group. So I will say one of the tools that we've tried to build and share externally are just a few examples, starting conversations about stuff our team does, so that we can make it a little bit less weird. And the aim of these facilitations, my favorite is called a harms model. And you can look it up. It's you can just do a search for like Microsoft harms modeling or Azure harms modeling. Is to make a space where people are expected to kind of bring their skeptics hat to the conversation. And it's kind of time bounded, and it's focused on a set of structured prompts. And we did that, again, not because we think we have all the answers or we know exactly all the people that could be negatively impacted, but actually more just the social discomfort from somebody needing to raise their hand and say, I'm not totally sure if I feel like we're meeting everybody where they're at, or I'm not totally sure if people from my community are actually going to be heard. Nobody likes to be that person who's going to slow down productivity or time to market because they raised a thorny issue. But when you can have a conversation that can be a little more structured, a little more outside, hey, let's talk about some things that none of us would want to happen, right? Shared goals. None of us would want these things to happen, right? We can look side to side and say, nobody wants this stuff to happen. And then with that, we can say one more question, or you as a team can ask one more question, which is, well, how would we measure if any of these things were happening? And that'd be my sort of, I think, safest starting point, so that no one individual feels like they have to be, the skeptic or the tinfoil hat wearer or a representative for their entire community if they themselves are a minority. To say, what are the things we all want to make sure don't happen, and how would we measure if one of those things was happening?
Thank you, Josh. That's great. Nigel asks, how do you feel that Microsoft AI tools can support AI on purpose?
It's a good question. We're very much still a work in progress, just like everyone. There are a number of tools that, especially some stuff that's been open sourced recently. One's called error analysis that our team worked on, which is about running intersectional classifiers to detect error pooling, kind of in like a decision tree type of way. There's also stuff that helps if you've got structured or labeled data to help you do kind of slice per subgroup. So fair, learn, and interpret ML are other examples. There are more, but I'll actually give you maybe a little bit of a different sort of angle of an answer, which is, I think Microsoft in its statements of values is probably doing the best right now. Because when we talk about empowering people to do more, and we are building a standard, an internal corporate standard that's all about responsible AI, it's forcing us to do probably the most important work as a group initially of figuring out how we make it more human-centered. So how we bring more disciplines together, how we talk about both the benefits and the risks, how we build reporting tools and documentation paths for how we talked about what we wanted to happen. And again, like I said, measuring if it wasn't happening. And as we build out examples or evidence and case studies of those things, we will share. So we shared recently, did a whole thing with the World Economic Forum to share a bunch of the work that our team, in concert with a bunch of folks at Microsoft, have been doing around responsible AI and purposefulness. We also publish things that are more sort of product specific. And so that's a big way that I think we're trying to work, is instead of it being like a, how to be responsible and sort of like one general thing, it's like, let's just bake it into the product documentation so that it's where people are at when they're trying to develop. Building more practices, especially sort of social thinking practices. So in addition to harness modeling, we have an approach called community jury that we've published externally, which is really about listening to the groups that are likely to be most affected and using that as our input for what we want to measure in our tooling or what we want to build in our tooling. It's a great question. It's a big, long list of intersecting goals. I think Microsoft's doing pretty well. I don't mean that super biased. I mean, I come from Google, who I thought was actually also doing it pretty well. I think a lot of the stuff that's being open sourced in TensorFlow is pretty effective. Although I know recently they've had some pretty rough public facing issues around publishing research. I think all these big tech companies are kind of struggling with the same issues. I would close by saying Microsoft's the only one that's funding a team like ours, which is a dedicated, 25-person team this is our whole job. All we do is just work hand in hand with product teams to solve problems in shipping, rather than trying to make it, trying to use only levers like policy or research.
Thank you, Josh. We do have a couple more questions. Are you okay to take some more, or are you
Sure.
running up to time?
No, fire away.
Sure. Farzaneh said, and this is a great question. Thanks, Farzaneh. She said, Josh, thank you. Interesting talk. Can you give examples of how you have convinced stakeholders who have high expectations from AI or automation bias to start small and don't aim for shiny, full automated AI?
It's a great question. I probably can't share in too much level of detail, because those are always weird conversations. Like, totally, such a good point, and I think the asker has experienced some stuff that I'm sure has been. I hear where you're coming from with that question. So the best thing is user research that I've found success with, at least. And it really, I wasn't sort of dancing around my playbook in the first question, Dave, that you asked. What we do very much transparently with all these product teams is connect with them, connect with their senior leadership, and get right out on the table, right as soon as possible. What's the awesome stuff that you're looking to make happen? What does amazing look like? for when you've built these systems. And even sometimes really kind of going on that adventure with them about the sort of super automated, super seamless, super it just works kind of approach, and writing down like, we think this is what we hear you saying. Is this right? You know? Yeah, totally. And then moving from that gives us the opportunity to earn license to go deeper. Okay, that's great. We want to make sure that happens too. And so we build a research roadmap, a user research roadmap, and we specifically articulate groups to recruit in that research that are, we would say, most likely to be underrepresented, to have been historically underrepresented, to be historically marginalized, to be most at risk for potential exploitation, or really to be the ones that whose voices would sort of go unheard if we didn't specifically overrepresent them in the research. And then we go and talk to them, and we outline these different areas in those categories around emotional and psychological well-being, physical well-being, around consequential services, human rights, societal impacts, job loss. And we emerge with very actionable, very specific, and very personal perspectives to share. Here's how these people feel about this stuff. They want the great thing you're talking about. Here's what would prevent them or get in the way from them feeling the thing or experiencing the great thing. And now we're going to talk about how we can fill in, how we can build a path towards getting everyone towards that better, more possible, more preferable future. Generally speaking, that lands pretty well. I had an executive recently just sort of sit back and kind of be like, wow, this really tells me we need to kind of go slow up front so we can run fast later. And now that executive has also experienced some of the brunt of having, potentially experienced the other side of wanting to run fast out of the gate and then just being sort of tripped along the way as various discoveries of unwanted outcomes were brought to their attention and they had to sort of firefight. And so there's no perfect thing here to to change the heart and the mind of someone in a position of significant influence. I think there is externalizing the story, of bringing in more voices, of doing it in an incredibly rigorous way. But more often than not, my experience has told me that people have to feel the feelings of others, and they have to feel the feelings of hurting somebody else in some way, hopefully manageably, so that they can feel how badly that does not, or how badly that makes them feel and how much they want to avoid that in the future. And I don't mean this to be like a dig at anybody. I've worked, I think, across the board, people I work with, incredibly well-intentioned, good folks. But we're all finding our way through this discovery. And just like each of us has had to learn how to be careful and thoughtful and kind to our fellow human being, we also were probably jerks in high school, where we said something that hurt somebody's feelings. We might have said something last week that hurt a colleague's feelings, and maybe, just maybe, they were brave enough to tell us. And that's how we move forward. And so it's that at a macro level. I know it's just kind of a long answer, and it was a very sort of like heartstrings answer, but I do legitimately mean that. It was the practice of inclusive design and inclusive research and playing out, how do we get the most awesome and how do we avoid the least awesome? There's also just the how do we help people feel feelings.
That's great. Thank you so much. At what point of designing Susanna an AI system should there be conversations on capability, followability when developing the project? Should it be on the business side or in the AI engineering side? And she says, great talk. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks. Yes, it's all over the place. The one of the most common sort of constraints, I guess, to acting in a more responsible fashion is the sense of helplessness that people can feel at any one part in the tool chain or in the life cycle. And usually that comes from a sense of isolation or feeling disconnected from other pieces. And like if you're, if you're just a consumer of an API, what can you be? Well, you can provide amazing feedback, and you also can build, more bespoke experiences. Or if you're just collecting data, you're just going to try to get as much data into the system as possible, and then let the diversity of it be handled by somebody else. There's all these different decisions all throughout the journey. And so, the answer to your question is it happens everywhere. The question is how safe or comfortable you feel to ask why about a couple different things. Why this data? Why this optimization? Why these success criteria? Why these end users? And anybody can ask those questions, and anybody can ask them at any point in the conversation. It's definitely easier to mitigate much earlier on in the development lifecycle, and to build more inclusive experiences. But I would say it does come down to that psychological safety within a group environment, to ask why at any point, and to expect to have a substantive answer about why a specific decision was made. Because again, the thing about AI that's maybe different or weird is there's all these sort of chains of dependency, and they're all by very, very different domain specialties. So research scientists and sort of especially theoretical or academic research scientists, actually I always forget, like right to left, left to right, very academic or theoretical research scientists they'll build to publish. Like that's where their primary approach to incentivization is to publish research. They publish, things are eminently more publishable when they are more novel. So novelty for the sake of novelty oftentimes. Then once they publish, and they're publishing usually against sort of standardized benchmark data sets or existing sort of standards or norms for measuring accuracy or something. Well, then it goes into sort of layer 2 of somebody who wants to build a proof of concept. And that usually is a very different skill set than sort of the more academic research or theoretical research science. And so that person building a proof of concept, do they know how to do the due diligence and inspect, hey, why that benchmark, or why that optimization parameter, or why that modeling technique, or what have you? Instead, they're just like, no, I'm trying to get to hello world, and I'm trying to make something that is going to work really well in this prototype context. And then it goes into sort of a third ring of scale. And someone saying, all right, that proof of concept worked, and that fundamental research seems like it's legit, so let's build it in. My colleague Hannah Wallach talks about this as like the sort of series of dependencies, or a series of things that people sort of like take and hand off, but it's sort of like a invisible baton pass. And so how do we make those connections clearer? How do we ask questions all along the way so that we can inspect, the data lineage and the intent behind, like the reproducibility steps behind the modeling approach. But ultimately, who is this for? Why them? How do we know that we actually have something that is representative of their use cases and their conditions? And how will we know if we're not achieving what it is that we're setting out to do?
Thanks, Josh. That's great. Okay, we have 2 more, which we'll try and wrap up, I guess, pretty shortly, just as people probably want to get on with today. We don't want to keep up too much time, but then again, for those who have missed, we also have this recorded, which we'll be sending out. So again, thank you, Josh, for that. So Atul asks, can you talk about scenarios, and then in brackets, WRT accuracy and bias, where, quote, working as intended has different meanings for 2 different consumers / producers of the system? Great question.
Sure, great question. Oh, so many. I'll give you 2 that sparked to my mind right up front. One is, say, a use case around media indexing. So say you've got a big corpus of information, a big corpus of like image content, photos or videos. And you want to allow somebody to do a search of that because they're, they're trying to find a file locally or in a big database or something. And the question, one of the things that it'll hinge a difference is, did they or someone that they know or in their immediate control collect and aggregate all of that content? Or did it come from outside of their control? Did it just sort of channel in from some extra source, right? Are you searching a corpus of information that you and your team have collected specifically and said, this is the stuff we care about? Or is it really broad? Because then you could do a search for something like the word family. And what would you expect to get in a set of results for the word family? Would you expect to get the nuclear family as America defines it, a man and a woman and 2.5 kids? Would you expect it to always be heterosexual couples? Would you expect it to even have children involved? Or could it have a pet? And could it involve somebody who's older? Like, is it multi-generational? So suddenly that difference of accuracy is seriously different if you've got control over the corpus, somebody's collected and they said, hey, here are the things that we're going to define the characteristics of and the boundaries around, versus like, here's what the internet told us, right? So that's one significant difference, because the expectation for how you apply that, are you going to apply that because you're looking for stock photos to put into a magazine? Are you going to apply that because you're searching for something in a presentation? Are you going to apply that because you're editing a film? The application context can be so different if you control the parameters. Here's the people we literally did the photo shoot with, versus if it comes from a broad, sort of less structured data set. Here's what the internet thinks the family looks like, right? So that's one significant difference of like what accuracy or working as intended can mean depending on the contextual expectations. Another one is, and this is one of my favorite sort of challenges, is something like content generation, where you'll have like all these different companies, Microsoft included, that want to make something that does like a smart compose or a smart reply. Is accuracy when somebody is offered one option and taps it every time? Or is accuracy something different? What we discovered in our work at Google, like our colleagues that led this work, I just benefited from their research, was that actually success was more about long-term satisfaction with the product. It almost had nothing to do with taps on the suggested items in inbox. So said another way, you could offer, and they offer 3 in inbox. This was the early prototype of inbox that turned into a bunch of new features in Gmail. They offered 3. And oftentimes, if you just looked at the accuracy rate, the thing that was most likely to be quote unquote clicked on or accurate, it was I love you. That was like the most accurate response, but like it's not always the best thing for every scenario, right? So instead what they found is actually it was when overall use and satisfaction increased because people qualitatively were really happy to have the 3 suggestions show up and then use none of them, but just be inspired by it. Like, oh, that made me think of a good way I could start writing my answer to this email. That moment in and of itself, this helps inspire me about what I could write. Like that was changed fundamentally because of the 3 options that were provided. It's a really different type of measurement of accuracy, right? Clicks versus inspiration and long-term satisfaction of a product.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Josh. And then I think the last one here, actually, this is a nice one. This is a fun one from Jazeera. Hello, it seems
it's about the military, isn't it? It's probably going to be.
Yeah, the recent trends, actually not, with self-driving cars and other areas of AI development is heading towards full automation. Are you aware of any recent research on human AI interaction with fully automated systems? And what do you think human AI interaction would look like in the near future?
It's a big, wide-ranging, great question. I have a lot of thoughts about the human AI interactions of the future that were sort of the backdrop for this presentation. So I might just offload a little bit to stuff that I've written. My short version, it's called "When Are We Going to Start Designing AI on Purpose?" So there's a Medium post that tries to catalog kind of like the last, 5 years of my weird voyage. My short answer is human AI collaboration, and that the amazing opportunity of the future to me is, and what keeps me optimistic in doing this work, is self-guided reflection towards self-improvement or self-betterment or self-education. I think about 2 topics in particular, one education and the other accessibility or assistive technology. As a person, I'm legally blind as a definition of my peripheral vision, but also my visual acuity. And I can see just well enough to sort of get by working on a screen close up. But it enthralls me about the future of sort of digital synesthesia, of turning visual capabilities into audio capabilities and vice versa, in ways that I can sort of hear the world or expand out my understanding of the world, so that maybe one day when more of my vision is gone, I'll still, be able to interact, or I'll be able to interact in new ways. The other is education, and I think about the different range, especially that we're seeing in the sort of remote learning stuff that I watch with my kids. That learning is a process of play. It's a process of building these predictions and using skills and trying to imagine stuff. And the more personalized and sort of flowing that can be, it's actually been remarkable to see how, I think, academically or scholastically, my kids have been able to really benefit from remote work, whereas socially, emotionally has been a challenge. So, how can AI provide some of these opportunities for privacy preserving, localized, human-computer collaboration in service of, the unique considerations of a kid with ADHD or dyslexia or multiple language learning, that can be specifically accommodated, and you can deal with those mismatches through AI capabilities that you can't just in a classroom setting where everyone's looking at the same board. There's another question in there about self-driving cars. I will say there's lots of research there. I think it's we probably actually need full automation. That's all the research that I've read is like the safest thing is actually when people stop being expected to sort of jump in at the last second and take the wheel back. So I think the biggest change actually comes from more interpretable systems that lead to better regulation. It's kind of a quirky answer to that, but and I probably answered these in the wrong order. But the safest system is actually the one that statistically has the car more in control and the human not trying to take over where they're not really able to. And so instead, we need to build better onboarding experiences and better learning experiences for how and why the system is doing what it's doing, so that we can build better comfort and use it in the right contexts, not just for everything.
On that note, thank you so much, Josh, for being very generous with your time, for giving us both a very specific set of framework for looking at this, but also a very beautifully larger context as well. And that's it's very unique to get that. So I'm very grateful to have you join us for this workshop. And for those who are joining us tomorrow as well for the conference sessions talks, those will kick off at 10:15 a.m. Pacific Standard Time tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we hope you could join us again for those. And Josh, again, thank you so much. I hope this is the first of many times we have a chance to share your great work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me. Appreciate it. Thanks all for the awesome questions. These are really brain twisters. It's good.
We'll be sending out hopefully a short summary at some point in the near future with some additional resources. I've posted some links to Josh's work here, his article, Medium. When are we going to start designing AI with purpose? And we've recorded the video, so once that's edited, we will send that out as well. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.